ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling a theory that'll really make you think what we call democracy in Europe might not be what it seems.
It's a bold one for sure.
We're exploring Antonio Garcia Trevijano's Facing the Great Lie. He claims that European countries, especially Spain, aren't true democracies, but something else entirely.
He really goes there. He says they're basically oligarchies in disguise.
Oligarchies, right? For those of us who need a refresher, meaning a small group holds all the power. But we vote, we have elections. How does that even fit?
That's the heart of what Trevijano breaks down. He looks at those core principles of representative democracy, the ones we're taught to believe in, and shows how they can be twisted to serve those in power.
Let's start with representative then. I always thought that meant we choose people to speak for us, to represent our needs. What's Trevijano's view on that?
His argument is that the way elections work now, we're not really choosing. It's more like we're handed a limited menu of options.
Pre-selected.
Exactly. And the selections are made by, you guessed it, the political parties. The real decisions, the power plays, happen behind the scenes, not out in the open where we, the citizens, can have a real say.
So it's like going to a restaurant and only having two dishes to pick from, both chosen by the chef. You can pick, sure, but are you really getting what you want?
That's the perfect analogy. It highlights the lack of real choice that Trevijano is getting at. He even brings up this legal scholar, Gerhard Leipoltz, who actually said these party-driven systems were a form of direct democracy. Trevijano, he just calls it out, says it's completely ridiculous. To him, it shows how distorted the definition of democracy has become.
It's like calling a square a circle. But how did we even get to this point? Where did these systems come from in the first place?
That's where it gets really fascinating. Trevijano digs into the history of European democracies and challenges some common beliefs about their development. Like, take the French Revolution. It's often seen as this huge turning point for democracy, right? But Trevijano, he pushes back on that. He questions whether it actually brought about a truly democratic age.
Wait, are you saying those history books we had were wrong?
Not necessarily wrong, more like maybe incomplete. What Trevijano suggests is that this whole idea of constant progress towards more democracy, well, it might be more complex than we've been told. He argues that instead of a steady march towards more citizen power, we've seen power solidify within political parties, leaving the public behind.
So if what we think of as democracy is more about parties controlling things from the shadows, what does that even mean for everyday people like us? Are we just along for the ride? So let's say, for argument's sake, that Trevijano's right on the money, that this great lie is the reality we're living in. How does a system like that keep going? Do they just depend on people not noticing?
Oh, it's way more intricate than that. It's not about brute force or anything. Trevijano says it's about how this great lie, it gets woven into the very way we think.
Interesting.
He talks about the language we use, even how we understand democracy itself. All of that can be manipulated to hide what's really happening.
So it's like propaganda, but instead of posters, it's about controlling the ideas themselves.
Exactly. Trevijano breaks it down into these categories: ideologies of power and ideologies of knowledge.
Okay, I'm following.
Think of things like liberalism or socialism. Those are ideologies of power, right? Out in the open, they've got agendas, we can debate them.
Makes sense.
But then you've got the other kind, the ideologies of knowledge, things like the state, the government, the Constitution. And the big one, democracy.
So ideologies of knowledge are presented as these neutral, objective truths. But Trevijano's saying they're actually used to prop up those in power.
You got it. They're made out to be practically sacred. Think about how often politicians use that phrase, defending democracy.
All the time.
Right. It's like the ultimate shield. Questioning it is almost unpatriotic.
I'm guessing Trevijano doesn't let intellectuals off the hook either.
No way. He's really critical of how, even with the best intentions, some intellectuals end up reinforcing this whole great lie. They don't dig deep enough, you know?
And by not digging deeper.
He calls it a kind of historical amnesia. We forget about the real struggles for genuine democracy that happened in the past.
Can you give me an example of what he means?
Sure. He points to the transition to democracy in Spain after Franco. It's often held up as a success story, right?
Right.
But Trevijano argues it was more about backroom deals between elites than a real grassroots push for change from the people.
So we're fed this simplified, optimistic version of history, And that makes it easier to accept that what we have is a genuine democracy, even if it's not quite the whole picture.
Exactly. It's like what we were saying before about the menu. If you've only ever tasted these two dishes, you might start to think that's all there is. You don't even realize there's a whole world of flavor out there that you're missing.
That's a powerful way to put it. But how does Treviano explain the fact that so many people are unhappy with the way things are? There are protests, movements for change, clearly. People aren't totally buying into this great lie.
Right, and this is where Treviano's ideas get really relatable. See, he says that feeling of disillusionment, that sense that the system is rigged against you.
Yeah.
It's not just paranoia. It's a natural consequence of living under a system that talks a big game, claims to be one thing, but then operates in a completely different way.
So how do we break free? What's Treviano's answer? What are his solutions for building a more authentic democracy? So we spent the last two parts of this deep dive really digging into this great lie, this idea that the democracies we live in, well, they might not be as democratic as we think. But Treviano doesn't leave us hanging, right? He's got some ideas about how to move forward, how to actually build a more authentic democracy. So what are those solutions? What's the way out?
Yeah, he does. Treviano firmly believed that a more genuine democracy is possible, but it takes a big shift, a whole different way of thinking about power itself. One of his biggest things was this idea of political freedom.
We talked about that a bit earlier. And it's not just about free speech and stuff like that. Right? It goes deeper than that.
Exactly. It's about having real power, the power to directly influence how things are run. Imagine a system where citizens were not just voting every few years, but we have actual ways to hold our leaders accountable, between elections.
Now, that sounds like a whole different ballgame. What kind of ways, what mechanisms is he talking about?
Well, one thing he proposed was this constitutional mechanism. It would be built right into how the government works.
Built in.
Yeah, almost like an emergency brake. If enough citizens believe that their leaders are abusing their power or going against the will of the people, boom, they can hit that brake.
Not just speaking out, but actually having a legal way to intervene.
Yeah.
That's bold. Like a safeguard against tyranny, almost.
Exactly. And Treviano, he often pointed to the American Revolution as an example, right? People saying enough and taking back control from a government that no longer served them.
He didn't just say copy the American system, though, did he?
No, not at all. He found inspiration in it, sure. But he knew every country, every situation, it's unique. Every nation has to find its own way to a more genuine democracy, one that fits its own context.
Makes sense. One size doesn't fit all when it comes to something as complex as, well, building a whole system of government.
Mm-hmm.
But how does this fit with the idea of popular sovereignty? I mean, giving people more power, isn't that what popular sovereignty is supposed to be about?
See, that's where Treviano really gets you thinking. He was actually pretty critical of how we use that term, popular sovereignty.
Really?
He said it's often used as this, empty phrase, an empty promise. It sounds good on paper, but there's no real way to make it happen. There's no engine behind it.
Like a car with a gas pedal but no engine, like you said earlier. You can push it all you want, but it's not going anywhere.
Exactly. And that's what he saw happening in a lot of modern democracies, this idea of the will of the people. It's used to legitimize the people in charge. But when it comes to the people actually exercising their will, there's nothing there. The mechanisms are weak or they just don't exist.
Wow. Kind of a sobering thought. So if we agree with Treviano, if we think our democracies are falling short, what can we actually do about it? What can any of us do?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And Treviano, he never claimed to have all the answers. He didn't write some step-by-step guide to revolution.
Right.
But what he did do was challenge us to rethink our whole relationship with power.
What does that look like, practically speaking? How do we even begin to do that?
It starts with awareness, with recognizing that what we've been told about democracy, it might not be the whole picture.
Okay.
And then it's about demanding more, demanding real transparency, real accountability from our leaders.
And demanding.
Those actual mechanisms, the ones we were talking about, the ones that give citizens a real voice, a real impact on the decisions that affect our lives.
That sounds like a long road ahead, but man, is it important. Treviano left us with this really thought-provoking idea, this idea that bringing about real change, it doesn't always mean convincing the majority. Sometimes it's about igniting a passionate, informed minority.
The 1/3.
Exactly. He believed that a dedicated 1/3 of the population, that's all it takes to spark a whole new era of democratic renewal.
Powerful stuff.
It really is. And it makes you think, doesn't it? We've seen it throughout history. Small groups, driven by their beliefs, by that desire for a better world, they can be the spark that ignites real lasting change. And that's the challenge to all of us listening today. Where do you stand? Are you part of that one-third?
Antonio Garcia Trevijano, his work pushes us to really examine what democracy means, what it means to us, and what role we're willing to play in building that more just, more equitable world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a better tomorrow.